have a very long and diverse history of political engagement, not just here in the United States, but in other countries as well. This political engagement extends past just voting. Most people, when you ask them about being involved in politics, instinctively the first thing they think of is, I go and vote. And we just had a debate here on campus last night for the Stanford mayor, and next week we have a lot of elections and more local races going on. And voting is usually the most obvious answer for political participation. However, there are a whole lot of other things Jews do in engaging in politics and in the political realm. Jews have served as government ministers, Jews have been party fundraisers, Jews have been political leaders in parties, in unions, and in a whole lot of different ways of engaging. So my first question is, how did this all start? Start of political engagement. Where did it begin for Jews? Well, let's go back to the source, the Bible. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, the verse is, let me put a king over me, like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely put over you a king whom the Lord your God chooses. Later in Deuteronomy, we see that we're commanded to establish, so that's what first verse, we're establishing a king. A king is definitely something political, right? A ruler. In Deuteronomy 16, we see, you shall appoint for yourself judges, officers in all your towns, which the Lord is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. So what have we got here? We've got now the establishment of a judicial system, a court system, and not just courts as we envision them today, but these judges were really almost like town councils or mayors, or really those who led the more local areas and decided issues in the local areas. And again, another verse that we really need to pay attention to from the Bible, from Numbers, where it says, gather to me 70 men from the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people, and their officers, and bring them to the tent of meeting, so that they should stand there with you. This verse is referring to the establishment of a Sanhedrin, or a group of master judges, a master court, that would hear all kinds of cases, and I'm going to talk about the Sanhedrin a bit more later. They would render halachic decisions on lots of different things, almost equivalent to our current Supreme Court, but the Sanhedrin was also a court of fact, not just law. And they would really deal even with more basic issues for the people. So we've got biblical verses that prescribe a king, a high court or some kind of court, and then a set of lower judges. So here we're seeing the Bible is our first inkling of some kind of governmental political participation. And then we move on historically, and Jews do eventually establish a court system and establish a king system. And the very first king of Israel, the original king of Israel, we have King Saul, who was followed by King David and King Solomon. By the Middle Ages, we start to see other forms of Jewish government and Jewish political participation form. So we have the establishment of some more autonomous Jewish communities called the Kahal. The Kahal was a very autonomous Jewish-type government in the Middle Ages in Europe. The Kahal had regulatory authority over the Jewish community, over communal facilities such as hiring a rabbi, maintaining a ritual bath. They also had a kashrus and the kosher designations in town. They had the other community facilities that they controlled also included education and Jewish education, charity. They also regulatory control over hygiene and sanitation in the town, tenant-landlord disputes in the town, loans, who was borrowing from who. And they were separate from secular forces, meaning they were outside the realm of whatever secular government existed over that town or country at that time. By the time the Kahal ended up being disbanded and different across Europe, once Jews were more integrated into the secular world and into the political sphere, they did not need the Kahal to have regulations over a lot of these areas. The secular government was taking over a lot of the regulations. Still, the Jews maintained some control over the Jewish entities, the shul, the ritual bath, the rabbi, but the secular entities were removed from the Kahal and were given now over to the secular government. By the 19th century, we see that most of the European Jews have become more integrated into a secular society and more liberal in their political viewpoints. And we start to see historically that even after the Kahal disbanded, Jews would then still hold positions and moved into positions of power with the secular government. And those positions of power did have a tremendous amount of influence. As early as the Renaissance, we start to see the establishment of a court Jew. Court Jews served as financiers, advisors, suppliers, diplomats, delegates to whoever was the ruling entity. Sometimes court Jews even served as advisors to very important businessmen or very important political leaders, not necessarily the king or the queen, but rather a territorial governor or a member of the parliament of the country. Court Jews, though, the difference between the Kahal and the court Jews was their integration into the Jewish community. While the Kahal and members of the Kahal were very integrated in the Jewish community as political leaders, as religious leaders also, the court Jews were separate from the Jewish community. They were allowed to live outside what would have been the Jewish ghetto. They did not have to wear any signs on their clothing signifying what they used to call the Jew badge. They also were able to have other jobs that might not have been, in addition to being the financial advisors and other advisors, they could have held other jobs that might not have been open to other Jews at that time. And they also tended to have, because they were much more integrated into the secular government and secular community, much higher intermarriage rates. And the other difference also is the court Jews were mostly in Austria and in Germany. You start to see similar types of court Jews who were allowed to live outside the Jewish areas in Russia and in other Eastern European entities. Court Jews also served as advisors to kings and other ruling monarchs. So before I continue, I think I would be remiss if I didn't extend outside of Europe and speak to one of the most famous court Jews, Maimonides, who we never think of as a court Jew, and we don't ever assume he was in that same position as a court Jew. But in honesty, he really was. Because think of what Maimonides did. We all know him as a Jewish philosopher and who was engaged in writings about Jewish law. But in Egypt, he had become he was born in 1138, just for some background, in Cordoba, died in 1204, is primarily known as a Jewish philosopher. He was also the private physician to the Sultan Saladin, and the Sultan's son. So while not technically a political post, more of a medical post, we all know how close we all are with our doctors. And even back then in the 1100s, the personal physician knew an awful lot about what was going on with the person he cared for. And Maimonides became a very close confidant of the Sultan. So he really was in a position to influence the Sultan of Egypt on certain political issues, on Jewish issues of that nature. Let's move on a little further. And I said it going from Moses to Joseph, I want to get a little closer to Joseph here, and get us into the 20th century. By the 20th century, we see that Jewish political engagement is booming around the world. And these are some of the countries that have had Jews in high-level governmental positions. In Austria, Jews served as finance minister, foreign minister. In France, Jews have served as justice minister, culture minister. India had a viceroy who was Jewish. Peru and Aruba had prime ministers who were Jewish. We see Jews have expanded their political engagement to very high ministerial positions, even in countries which you don't always think of having a large Jewish community. I'm not really sure how many Jews are in Aruba, but one of them made it to the prime minister's position. Probably fewer than in Brooklyn. The idea is that, and we'll get into this, why are Jews politically engaged? Even outside of the United States, Jews feel a need to participate in the political spectrum, participate in the government as a way to maybe try and help their fellow Jews. And a lot of Jews who get involved in political environment use it as a way to help fellow Jews. This is a way I can help. So, moving out of Europe and other parts of the world to our own continent, North America. It's not just Europe, it's not just Australia, it's not any of those other places where Jews have acceded and participated politically. In Canada, Jews have served as mayors of Montreal, Toronto, Edmonton, Côte St. Luc, New Waterford. Jews have been members of the Canadian Parliament, provincial governors, and have also been in ministerial positions for the Prime Minister. In Mexico, Jews have also served in ministerial positions and also as territorial governors. A territory in Mexico is similar to like a state here in the US, and Jews have served as governors there. So Jews have even become, again, in areas where there are not exactly enormously large Jewish populations, we see Jews engaging and becoming involved in the political process. Which brings us to the United States. Jews have a history of political engagement in the United States even before we were the United States. The first Jews to come to the US were in 1654. 23 Jews came to New Amsterdam from Holland. A year later, Jews earned the right to formally establish a Jewish community. They got formal approval from the Holland government, the Dutch government, to establish this. Ultimately, New Amsterdam was renamed New York. And after some time, even the British allowed the Jews to stay and establish their community. She'erit Israel was the very first synagogue established, built by Jews in 1730. What does that mean? Why is it so significant, the very first synagogue? Well, that means you're here, you're staying, you're a community. A synagogue is a very central place for the Jewish community. Okay, building a building, establishing a synagogue means that you're now part of the community, you're established, you're staying, you're going to be there. And that was very significant that Jews would not necessarily be pushed out of the community. In 1733, we start to see the very first Southern Jewish community established in Savannah. It becomes a permanent community about 50 years later. Took them that long to get the official charter. But Jews in the South, I'm going to talk a little bit more about it when I get to the Civil War, have a very long history of living in southern states. South Carolina, Charleston, Savannah, Atlanta, all have very long, rich histories of Jews living there and engaging politically there, which we'll talk about a little more. Jews were, pre-Civil War, Jews were living all up and down the 13 colonies. You had pockets of Jewish communities all over the place. And by 1740. The British Plantation Act. Now, why do I mention the British Plantation Act? This was a very significant piece of legislation that allowed Jews a limited form of citizenship in the British colonies. What is this limited form of citizenship? Jews were now to be treated as somewhat more equal in property rights, but they still didn't have the right to vote. But they were gaining more citizenship than a slave, okay? More citizenship, the ability to engage and talk and be part of the community, but not be allowed to vote. New York State is the first state to emancipate Jews. New York was the first state to emancipate a lot of people. Freed blacks were voting in New York before almost any other state. Women were voting in New York before almost any other Eastern state. And Jews are now given equal rights in New York. Makes me proud to be a New Yorker, I guess. So New York is the first place to emancipate Jews. And we start to see that that really kicks off Jewish involvement. And even back during this time period, Jews are, oh my God, I now have this right, let me take advantage of it. I'm now equal to these people, let me take advantage of it. Let me start voicing my opinions. Let me get politicians to start listening to me, okay? And let me see how I can affect change and what I can do. So then we fight the war against the British. We win, we become our own country. We're now the United States. In 1787, the Constitution is ratified, and part of the Constitution in the Bill of Rights, the very, very first thing in the Bill of Rights, we see the First Amendment where it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Why is this such an important thing? Additionally, let's look at its placement. This quote, this provision, is the very first part of the Bill of Rights. The Constitution has three parts to it. The first part of the Constitution is the preamble, the introductory paragraph. The second part of the Constitution are the articles, which set up our system of government. And then, because there were a lot of people in colonial America who looked at the Constitution, the articles of the Constitution, and said, wait a minute, you're not protecting any individual rights. These people were known as anti-federalists, and they refused to support the Constitution unless provisions were added to protect people's individual rights. These provisions were known as the Bill of Rights, and they're the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The very first of these 10 amendments, the First Amendment, which is the one a lot of us are familiar with, it's got all of these very specific individual rights. Among them, this one, the religion, speech, press, right to assemble, and right to petition the government. All in the very first amendment of the Bill of Rights. But what's even listed first is this right of a free religion. Must say something. Religion was kind of important, and freedom of religion was kind of important. We know, if we remember all our history from when we were young kids, and why did the Pilgrims come to America? What were they seeking? Which is why we celebrate Thanksgiving in a few weeks. Religious freedom, freedom from religious persecution. And we know that religion was a big thing. Our founding fathers were deists who believed in a God. And here they are codifying this individual right of freedom. But let's take it one step further. There's two parts of this First Amendment right of freedom. Now, what are these two parts? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. What does that mean? That means there is no United States religion. There is no official religion of the country, okay? Unlike, say, England, which is the Church of England, or Saudi Arabia, which is Islam. United States has no official religion. The second part, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, means I can choose how I want to worship my religion. If I say it is a religious requirement to eat broccoli every Tuesday, I have that religious right to eat broccoli every Tuesday. Government can't and won't and shouldn't tell me how to worship my religion, how to worship in my religion. Now, why is this very important? I'll tell you, this is very important because now Jews, having come from European countries where religious activities might have been prohibited, like kosher meat slaughter, or the establishment of a ritual bath, or any other things that people do religiously, which would have been prohibited. Now we're being told by the government, totally okay, worship how you want to worship. Be as free as you want to be free. In my religion and politics course, we look at this and we say that's also what leads to the United States, there's a little tangent here, having a very pluralist society in religion. I live in Brooklyn. You can't spit without hitting a church, synagogue, mosque, temple, or something anywhere in the borough. There's so many religious institutions all over the place and all over the hundreds of different religions being observed. And that's what this part of the First Amendment is saying. We're going to be open to any religion and we're going to allow people to worship the way they want to. There's one other thing I need to point out with this part of the First Amendment. The very, 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 very first word in it. Congress. Remember, we have different levels of government in this country. In federalism, we've got local government, state government, and federal government. This First Amendment is only speaking to federal government. Our Congress can't have an official religion. Doesn't say anything about the states, right? During colonial America, even until the late 1700s, many states had official state religions. In Massachusetts, our neighbors just to the north, the Puritan religion was the official religion. Maryland was known as a Catholic colony. You had the Church of England in North and South Carolina. You had Quakers in Pennsylvania. A lot of states had really officialized the religions. And these freedoms did not necessarily trickle down to our state and local governments. However, the lack of equality statewide did not stop Jews from participating, did not stop Jews from being engaged. In 1796, Dr. Levi Myers of Georgetown, South Carolina, was the very, very first Jew elected to serve in a state legislature. So while he probably couldn't vote for himself, and probably then couldn't get his mom to vote for him either, well, actually, women weren't voting to begin with. So he couldn't vote for himself. His congregation couldn't vote for him. He still took it upon himself to run and be active and engaged politically. Okay? Additionally, voting and getting elected to office is only one form of participating politically. Another activity that was very prevalent during the Revolutionary War in colonial America was fundraising. Chaim Solomon was a Jewish businessman in Philadelphia who raised money to support George Washington and the colonial army. There is a legend that has the first Yom Kippur appeal being done for the Revolutionary Army. We all have Yom Kippur appeals in our own synagogues. That very first one was Chaim Solomon saying we have to support the colonial army. Another form of political participation is service in the military. I'm sure many of the gentlemen here have had the experience to serve in the military, and Jews have a very long-standing, proud tradition of political engagement by serving in the military. Jews until World War II, the Jewish percentage of serving in the military relative to their percentage of a population was higher. Larger percentages of Jews would serve in the military than was their percentage of the national American population. During the Revolutionary War, 160 Jews out of 3,000 Jews served for the Washington's army, for the colonial army. I don't have data on Jewish service in the British Army. The Civil War is kind of interesting. Remember how I said Jews were living in all North and South and had long-standing historical traditions in South Carolina and Georgia. Over 3,000 Jews served in the Confederate Army, including Judah P. Benjamin, who had been in the U.S. Senate. Then when the South seceded, he became a high-ranking confidant of Jefferson Davis and served as foreign minister, or the equivalent Secretary of State, for the Confederate state. Additionally, 7,000 Jews served in the Union Army, 150,000 Jews in total. So look at how high percentages. 10,000 Jews out of 150,000 were serving in the military. Additionally, over 600 Jews were killed during the Civil War. There were 9 generals of Jewish descent and over 20 colonels of Jewish descent serving during the Civil War. During World War I, about 250,000 Jews served out of just under 3 million. And what was interesting is Jews made up 3% of the total U.S. population during World War I time. They made up almost 5% of the military. Again, a much higher percentage. World War II, over 500,000 Jews served in World War II out of about 4.7 million. Over 50,000 of those Jews received medals for bravery and valor. There was also situations during World War II where Jews were actually among those that were liberating the camps in Europe. And the experiences of the Jews that had been in the camps being liberated by fellow Jews, realizing there were still Jews around. The numbers drop a bit for the Korean and Vietnam Wars, where you're starting to see much smaller percentages of Jews serving. About 150,000 Jews served in Korea out of just under 5 million, and very much fewer served in the Vietnam War, 30,000 out of about 5.5 million Jews. Today, there are fewer Jews serving in the military, but it is still a form of political involvement and political engagement. So I would like to just touch on a few other aspects of Jewish political engagement and forms of community activism. Jews have served as leaders of labor movements, union leadership, the ILGWU, Amalgamated Workers, the Workmen's Circle, even the original founders of the American Federation of Labor, all Jews. Jews have been at the forefront of advocating for workers' rights, union workers' rights, non-union workers' rights, 8-hour workday, safe workplace situation. Even if you think of the motto of the Communist Party, workers of the world unite, okay? And the idea of workers having rights, very much Jewish concepts, which brings me into political parties. Jews have been also very engaged in the forming of political parties, including the Socialist Party here in the United States, the U.S. Communist Party. At the high point of the Communist Party in the United States, there were 9 communist newspapers published. One of them was in Yiddish. Even the Students for a Democratic Society, which brings me also into the student activist movements, was a more communist bent to it and was led by a Jew. I don't think I have to really go in depth into Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement. I know a year or 2 years ago we had Susanna Heschel who came and spoke. Her father, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, was one of the leaders of the civil rights movement and would march arm in arm with Martin Luther King on many of his rallies and protests. Jews were also engaged in the Freedom Summer, in the mobilization of voting rights and registration, and really guided a lot of the civil rights movement. A lot of the civil rights organizations, SNCC and CORE, also had Jewish founders or principles, were based on Jewish principles. And not just the black civil rights movement, but Cesar Chavez, when he was advocating for the Latino migrant workers in California, was engaged and did work with Jewish leaders there also to engage, and he was trained and he got training from Jewish leaders on nonviolent but forceful confrontation. So you have Jews involved not just in the Black civil rights movement, but also in the Latino movement. The feminist movement, Betty Friedan and Ernestine Rose, some of the Jewish leaders of the movement who advocated political and social equality with men, advocated for women to have rights in marriage, and that once you got married, you didn't lose your rights, advocated for the acknowledgement of spousal rape, that yes, your husband unfortunately can rape a wife, and that should be a crime if a strange man raped your wife. And that was advocated by female Jewish leaders. And then we come to the student activist movement. The student activist movement of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s spread all over college campuses, starting with the Ivy Leagues into the Big Tens. I'm sure even up at stores they had it also. And the students were protesting against prejudice, discrimination, very pro-Israel. I have a quote I wanted to share with you to show how about Jewish political engagement. The American Council of Education concluded after a survey of 1966 to 1977 that the most accurate predictor of protest was the matriculation of Jewish students. Meaning, what does this mean? The more Jewish students you had on campus, the more likely you were going to have protests and rallies on campus. That was the number one, not where they were from, not what the issue is, not how old the kids were, not what they were studying. You would think, maybe the political science majors who were engaged or whatever. No, being Jewish. Being Jewish in the college meant that was going to lead you to more likely to have a protest. I found that to be hysterically fascinating. Other protests and rallies. Jews have had a long history, as I said, even before the ability to have vote, of being engaged and in rallying and in protesting things. Starting with the slavery in the United States, I would like to even go that far back. There were Jews who were on both sides of the slavery issue. There were Jews who were abolitionists who thought it should be disbanded and who engaged in anti-slavery rallies. And then the Jews in the South it was a part of their life and their cultural history also, who felt it shouldn't. So even starting in the 1840s and 1850s, Jews are rallying and engaging politically in the anti or pro-slavery movements. In 1860, Jews protested in Washington against the actions of the Pope in Rome. The Pope had taken some kid who had been orphaned and pushed him and tried to raise him in the Catholic Church, and Jews were rallying against that. In the early 1900s, Jews formed protests against the murder of fellow Jews in Kishinev pogroms in Russia. In the 1920s, Jews were rallying in Washington against the Immigration Acts, which closed Jewish immigration. By the way, everyone, current political discussions on limiting immigration is not anything new. These date back at least 100 years. In 1942, the Jews in the United States were protesting in support of the creation of a Jewish Palestine in the Middle East. This is already during World War II. The war is happening and Jews are advocating and protesting that they want a Jewish homeland. In 1943, rabbis from every denomination across the country came together and rallied in Washington to increase quota for refugees fleeing the Nazi advance in Europe. They weren't successful. In 1965, again, a new immigration quota was placed and more rallies. And during the Cold War, post-World War II to the late 1980s, Jews regularly would protest in support of Soviet Jewry. I myself went to many a rally. You couldn't be a kid in the yeshiva in the 80s and 90s without going to some kind of rally to protest for our brethren in the Soviet Union to be freed. We went regularly. It was like at least a twice-a-year experience where we'd all pile into buses and drive down to Washington and rally and then pile back on the buses and drive back up to New York. But we were rallying. We were engaging politically. And these are all forms of political participation. Okay? So here's my next question. Why do Jews feel so comfortable in the United States engaging in these forms of political participation? Even if they don't have equal rights, even if they're not allowed to vote, why are they still getting involved? Well, it's because many principles of our government are based on biblical tenets. Things that we just assume are so obvious have its roots in biblical, in somewhere in the Bible. And we talked about the establishment of courts. But additionally, the idea of 3 branches of government and division of government, separation of powers. Isaiah chapter 33, for Hashem is our judge, Hashem is our lawgiver, Hashem is our king. God is the judge, the lawgiver, the king. 3 branches. A republican form of government. In Samuel, chapter 8, discusses all the different ways and reasons and how-tos of appointing a ruler and what the rulers are doing. The establishment of courts and a judiciary. I had the other verses before, but additionally, Exodus chapter 23 talks about the integrity of the judicial process. The idea of a fair trial. Do not accept a false report. Leviticus, you shall not commit a perversion of justice. So a lot of basic American government principles is Bible inspired. Remember, our founding fathers were deists. They all read the Bible. In his library in Monticello, Thomas Jefferson had multiple versions of the Bible, including his own that he wrote. It's a long, complicated thing. The other thing where Jews have often felt so comfortable being politically engaged and being engaged in the political process is the concept of tikkun olam, which is very much a Jewish concept, which translates technically to repair the world. Now that's very lofty, so let's try and bring it down to how we can understand it. What do we mean by tikkun olam? Jews feel the sorrows of fellow Jews. Jews feel the sorrows of fellow man. Almost an idea of a linked fate with our fellow Jew. Okay? We want to fix things. We want to make things better for our fellow Jew. We also, how can we do that? How can we fix things? How can we make things better? We can get involved and change. We can run for office. We can have a rally. We can get involved. We can vote for people who can change and who can make a change. Additionally, Jews also historically have been segregated, have been ostracized, and so in this country, we want to prevent that from happening to others. Again, we're going to get involved, Jews are going to get involved to try and prevent others from being left out, so we can bring them in, so we can guide them along. And finally, Jews have also had a strong background in the pursuit of justice. In Deuteronomy, it says, tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice, you shall pursue. It is biblically prescribed that we pursue a sense of right, of fairness, of justice. So, how do you pursue justice? You get involved in the judiciary. You become a lawyer. You become a judge. You become a Supreme Court judge. In the history of the United States, 8 people of Jewish descent have served on the Supreme Court, starting with Louis Brandeis, who was the first Jew appointed to the Supreme Court, which ties in also with our Kiriansky lecture from a few weeks ago. And finally, to the 3 of the current 9 judges. 1/3 of the Supreme Court right now are Jewish. Jews are not nearly 30-something% of the U.S. population, but Jews are 30-something% of the Supreme Court. And no, I am not related to Justice Ginsburg. His name is spelled differently, although we both are very tough Brooklyn girls. The other thing with pursuing justice is what better way, go back to what I said just a few minutes ago, what better way to try and help your fellow man, right, of tikkun olam, of trying to want to help people, than by dispensing fair justice to all. But Jews have not just gotten involved politically as Supreme Court judges. Jews also run for office in much higher numbers relative to their percent of the U.S. population as a whole. Currently, there are 8 Jewish senators serving in the Senate out of 100. I can tell you again, Jews are not 8% of the U.S. population. All of them are either Democrat or leaning Democrat. And not all of them come from enormously large Jewish populated states either. There are very few Jews in Hawaii, Vermont, Oregon, but yet they've elected Jewish senators. Interestingly enough, until 2016, California was represented by 2 Jewish female senators. Barbara Boxer was the other Jewish senator from California. And what's interestingly to note, Senator Schumer from New York, who not only is a Jewish senator, but he is also the Democratic minority leader of the Senate. But it's not just in the U.S. Senate where Jews have gotten involved. In the House of Representatives, there are over 22 Jewish House members from 13 states, with the exception of 2, they're all Democrats. Oh, I want to back up for a minute with the senators. The very first Jew to serve in the United States Senate, in case anyone is curious, was also a Democrat from Florida, but back then in 1840, Democrats were a little different. David Levi Yulee was the very first Jew to serve in the Senate. And in the United States House of Representatives, there have been a whole lot of other Jews who have served in the House, including Barney Frank from Massachusetts, who was the first, not just a Jew to serve in the House, he was the first openly gay member of the House of Representatives. Eric Cantor, who served in the House from Virginia, who had been the House Majority Leader, Republican, till he was defeated, and Tom Lantos. Tom Lantos was a congressman from California who was a Holocaust survivor and had been in a German labor camp in Bulgaria till he was liberated, came to the United States, and he served in the House of Representatives and used his experiences as a Holocaust survivor, influenced his legislation and his legislative priorities. The first Jew elected to the House of Representatives was in 1844, Louis Charles Levin from Pennsylvania, and he was not a Democrat, nor was he a Republican. He was from the Know Nothing Party. Currently, in addition to the 8 Jews in the Senate and the 22 in the House of Representatives, the current U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, and Secretary of Veterans Affairs, David Shulkin, are both Jewish. And finally, Jewish activity at a local level. 11 cities in the United States currently have Jewish mayors, including, again, cities with not where you would think there were so many Jews living there. I'm not really quite sure how many Jews are in Chattanooga or Madison, Wisconsin, or even Anchorage. And of these 11, 2, except for 2, all are Democrat. Jews also serve locally, not just as mayor. You have Jews that will run for office as town council, city council, school boards, and all kinds of local officials also, as a way to get involved politically at the local level. Jews have not yet been successful in running for president or vice president. We know in 2000, here's where we get Moses, we did, now we're getting to Joseph. Joseph Lieberman ran unsuccessfully for vice president with Al Gore. I must share a personal story about this. In fact, it was very interesting. During the campaign in 2000, Senator Lieberman was very welcomed and very comfortable in a lot of these southern black churches. And he would go in and talk Bible with the Bible Belt Christians and was very welcomed in there. His being Jewish and being an Orthodox Jew didn't hinder his ability to run and didn't hurt the ticket. And there's a lot of research that was done asking that question, and it shows that he didn't. We've talked a whole lot about Jewish political engagement in everything but voting. Let's get to voting. Originally, in the United States, most states, as I said, had religious requirements to vote, so most Jews could not vote at all. By 1790, the religion requirements in every state had been eliminated, so Jews felt they could vote, and they did. Prior to 1860, there was very little consistency on Jewish voting patterns. We don't really know, there's not much research done, and we don't really know who did what and how they did it and why they did it. The only consistent thing was Jews were voting. Why do Jews vote? I have spent years studying voting. I sort of have some answers, and I'm still developing them also. Voting to Jews is a way of saying Hakaras HaTov to the American population. Hakaras HaTov is thanking or acknowledging the good. Technically, it means acknowledging the good. Jews vote as a way of acknowledging the good that the United States has done to them or for them. So they vote. And that was proposed by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was a great rabbinic scholar of the late 20th century. And he said, we should vote, and Jews should go and vote, saying thank you to the government. Voting is a Kiddush Hashem. Voting to not vote would make the governmental officials look negatively on Jews. And this was a point advocated by Rabbi Avigdor Miller and Rabbi Shimon Schwab, also leading rabbinic scholars of the late 20th century. We need to vote, and Jews should vote, because if we don't, they'll look badly on us. The government will look negatively on us. So, Jews have been voting, and we vote today. And until 1932, Jews were mostly Republican. What happened in 1932 to shift Jewish voting? 1932 was a realigning election where a lot of the political cleavages shifted, and what was once a more liberal political tradition became more conservative, and what was once a more conservative political tradition became more liberal. 1932 was when the Jews became a part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal coalition. And now we start to see the trend of Jews voting for the Democratic candidate. Okay? So we've got here 40 years from 1932 to 1972, and you see pretty consistently, with the exception of Stevenson in the 50s, because apparently everybody really did like Ike, Jews pretty consistently voted for the Democratic candidate. From a high of the 90s for Roosevelt and for Johnson, even to 60%, which is not so horrible, for Stevenson. Additionally, there was some third-party candidates in both 48. Wallace, who ran, was the former vice president, who was extremely liberal and almost to the point of being a communist, which attracted Jewish voters. The other Wallace in 68 was on the opposite end of the spectrum, was Governor Wallace from Alabama, who was extremely conservative, running on a states' rights platform. So here we see a very consistent Jewish democratic vote. We go and we move further along in history, and what do we see? Still very consistent, with one glaring difference. Let's talk about 1980 for a minute, shall we? Jimmy Carter, not well liked by the Jews. Okay, Jimmy Carter was viewed as having a very pro-Arabist outlook politically. But what's interesting about the 1980 election is Reagan didn't do so well either amongst the Jews. It's not just that Carter got 45%. So you would think, okay, Reagan is getting 50-something%. Remember, in 1980, John Anderson was running as an independent. And he was able to take votes from both Reagan and Carter. Okay? Now, the other thing I want to bring to our attention is, remember previously we had Democratic vote from Jews in the 80s and 90s here, right? It's changing. Let's go down into Clinton is only in the 80s, right, into the 70s. The Jewish vote for Democratic candidates is still enormous and still way over the normal population. However, it's declining. Before we get to Jewish voting declining, why do we care about how Jews vote? I mean, I care because I care about everybody's voting, because I'm a very big nerd when it comes to voting. My students can tell you that. I care. But why should we care? We should care because where do Jews live in the United States? Let's talk about some math. We know that we don't elect the president. Voters don't elect the president. The Electoral College elects a president. The states with the 4 largest Jewish populations in the United States, New York, California, Florida, and New Jersey. These 4 states have the 4 largest Jewish populations. They total already 127 Electoral College votes. Okay, that's almost half of what you need to be president. If we expand it and go to the states, 10 states with the largest Jewish populations, the 10 largest Jewish populations in the United States, in these 10 states, you get to 244 Electoral College votes. All right? What do we see from this? Jews live in big states. Big states are important if you're running for president. You want to be successful for president? You need to get the Jewish vote. Jews also donate money. Pro-Israel groups have raised since 2000 raised and distributed over $130 million. Okay? Pro-Arab PACs, less than $1 million. So you've got Jews living in big states and lots more money. Something to think about. However, this Jewish voting trend is shifting. Let's get a few numbers. The numbers now, from now on, the numbers I'm sharing with you is from a 2013 survey by the Pew Research Foundation on Jews in America. And the funny part about the whole thing is they called me and asked me to participate. So I'm looking at these numbers, I'm going, wait, I'm one of those 10% Orthodox. And when I got the results and I could remember the questions they asked me, I'm going, oh my God, I'm one of those people in the chart. It was very cool. Anyways, the U.S. Jewish population as a whole breaks down sort of about this, give or take a little bit here or there. That 10% are Orthodox, 18% are religiously conservative. Okay, not politically conservative, 2 different things. 35% Reform, 6% other, 30% claim no denomination. Okay, here's where we get the interesting stuff. Jews, 70% of Jews identify as Democrats, 22 as, or leaning Democrat, 22 Republican or leaning Republican, and 8% as other. When you break it down by ideology, 49% of Jews consider themselves to be liberal, 29% moderate. So if you do the math, it's almost 80% of Jews are either liberal or moderate. Only 19% are conservative or refuse to answer. Let's combine now these 2 tables. Jewish party identification and ideology by denomination. This is very interesting. Let's pay close attention. When you break up the Jewish community into the 4 categories, again, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, or other or no denomination, and then we broke it up by who's a Democrat, who's a Republican, and the political ideology, you start to see some very, very interesting facts. Orthodox Jews are the least likely to be Democrats. They're also the least likely to be liberals. Reform Jews are the most likely to be Democrats and the most likely to be liberals. Why is this important? Let's look at a few more numbers. Orthodox Jews have higher birth rates than non-Orthodox Jews. More like 4 children to 1.7 children. Children in Orthodox households, the average number of children in an Orthodox household is 2. It's not even a half in a Reform household. Intermarriage rates. In the same study, the percentage of Jews with a non-Jewish spouse, 2% for Orthodox, 50% for Reform. Raising children. 97% of Orthodox Jews are raising their children as Jewish. Only 60% of Reform Jews are raising their children as Jewish. So what does all of this mean? Why do we care? When you add together higher birth rates, lower intermarriage rates, and a higher likelihood of raising your children as Jews. It equals an increasing number of Orthodox Jews and a decreasing number of Democratic Jews. So what is the future of Jewish voting and Jewish participation? If I had a crystal ball, I would tell you this. My grandchildren will probably be Republicans. The future of Jewish voting, go back to this table, these numbers are going to continue to flip. It's no longer going to be 90% of the Jewish vote for the Democratic candidate. We're getting 70%, and maybe in 8 years, 12 years, it'll be into the 60s, right? Maybe in 16 or 20 years, it'll be about 50-50. By the time my grandchildren are probably voting, this is going to be completely reversed. Why? Orthodox Jews are growing in number, and they're the more politically conservative votes. Jews are shifting as a population as a whole. Younger Jews are less engaged politically. All the rallies and the protests and other forms of political engagement done by Jews is not happening as much now. Okay? So Jews are feeling more removed from the liberal tradition and more comfortable in a Republican tradition. The other last point I want to make is it's not just Jews. Religiously conservative people are more likely to be Republicans. In surveys, there are two measures of religious observance. The first measure is how often do you attend church? The second measure is how much of a role does religion play in your daily life? If you say a lot, you're more likely, if religion plays a tremendous role in your daily life, you're more likely to be a Republican. For Orthodox Jews, attend synagogue frequently. At least my husband and sons pray 3 times a day with a quorum, okay? If not, at least every day. And religion plays a very significant role in their daily lives. Those two categories of more politically conservative groups apply to Orthodox Jews. So like I said, if I could have a crystal ball, I see these numbers flipping ultimately. Thank you all very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.